Well, with House of the Dragon Season 2 having come to a close, and it being the last thing we get from the Game of Thrones universe until A Night of the Seven Kingdoms next year, what a better time to rank all 10 seasons of the Game of Thrones universe than now. Hello everybody, my name is Dustin, aka Drex, and welcome back and/or to the channel. And today we are going to be ranking all 8 seasons of Game of Thrones and both seasons of House of the Dragon. First of all, I'm not going to go into in-depth reviews on each season, as I am going into this assuming that you have either seen the season yourself or know enough to be watching a ranking about them. With that in mind, there will also be spoilers for all 8 seasons of Game of Thrones and both seasons of House of the Dragon. With all that out of the way, let's get started. To absolutely nobody's surprise at all, in last place is Game of Thrones Season 8. We all know why this is bad, from the character assassinations to the giant plot holes, the out of left field plot twists that don't understand why the plot twists in the first few seasons worked, and just straight up forgetting events that happened in the prior episode. For example, at the end of one episode, Arya finds a horse and rides off onto it. But in the beginning of the next episode, we go through those same events again, but there's no horse. But with all that said, if you forget that this is a season and the final season of Game of Thrones, it does get mildly better, as you are able to ignore all the character assassinations and things that just don't really make sense for this universe, and just kind of enjoy the good things, like the impressive CGI and action, how it looks good for the most part, and the more often than not good acting. But all that said, that still doesn't excuse the mountain of problems, like how you cannot see pretty much the entirety of episode 3. But I will say this season does still have one good episode in episode 2. Episode 1 I found to be pretty alright, and episode 3, sure, you can't see what's going on, but what you can see isn't that bad. Except for Arya killing the Night King. I have no idea why they made that decision. Before I talk about this season itself, I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way. I put Game of Thrones into 3 categories. The first 4 seasons, which are just perfect. Seasons 5 through 7, which are flawed but still enjoyable. And Season 8, which we all know what Season 8 is. All that said, I think Season 5 is the least enjoyable of the flawed but enjoyable seasons. Don't get me wrong, this is still a massive leap in quality from Season 8, but I just find this season kinda boring. With the exception of Hardhome, not a lot happens this season. Tyrion spends pretty much the entire season either in a box or being held captive. Dany isn't really doing much new except for dealing with the Sons of the Harpy, which just suck. Speaking of sucks, Arya's entire plotline for this season and most of next season is just so boring. It also skips over the entire final battle that Stannis is in and kills Stannis off screen. To top all that off, Jaime and Bronn are then sent to Dorne for the entire season, where they go through one of the worst plot lines of the show. Speaking of one of the worst plot lines of the show, this season introduces the High Sparrow, which is the worst thing to happen in King's Landing in the entire show. This season also is the beginning of the smart characters becoming stupid, with Littlefinger marrying Sansa off to Ramsay for no reason at all. However, I will say this season probably has the best final scene of a season in the entire Game of Thrones universe with Jon's death, which, while it didn't really work well next season, for the ending of this season is amazing and is very shocking. And also, overall, aside from, again, smart characters getting dumb, most of the characters are still intact, and you get some cool new interactions, like Stannis in the North. Next up is Game of Thrones Season 7. Now, this season is kind of the exact opposite of last season. While last season was pretty boring, it still had pretty well written characters, and most of the characters were also intact. This season is definitely not boring, but it also has some of the dumbest writing in the show, and all of the characters are definitely getting pretty dumb just in general here. But while Season 5 does have better writing, this season I think is better than that due to all the unique interactions we get. First off, there's the obvious one of Jon and Dany's plot lines finally meeting up. There's also Episode 7, which probably has the most main characters in one location of the entire show, with pretty much the entire main cast of this show at this point all in King's Landing. But now, while the plan to go beyond the wall to get a White Walker is very dumb, it does lead to Episode 6, which I found entertaining enough, but again, Gendry just sprinting to the wall in like a day doesn't really make sense. And it also does lead to the aforementioned Episode 7, which has every character ever, and I find a pretty decent episode in and of itself. Now, while this season does have a lot of teleportation going on, it does lead to faster storytelling, which means we get to skip over a bunch of the boring traveling episodes and just get straight to the interesting stuff. And it means we get way more battles, which, honestly, I'm fine with. Out of the enjoyable but flawed seasons, Season 6 is by far the best of them and the least flawed. While the characters continue to get dumber, every episode this season propels the plot forward. For example, Jon starts the season dead, and by the end of the season is King of the North. Dany starts the season held hostage, and by the end of the season is heading to Westeros with an entire army. Arya starts off as blind, and by the end is John Wick. There's also the Battle of the Bastards, which sure has a dumb start, and the Army of the Vale has no reason for being kept a secret up until the final battle, but within the episode itself, the battle is still pretty good. It also has one of the best season's finales with Winds of Winter, an episode that starts off with an amazing little montage sequence that puts an end to one of the worst plot lines of the show with one of the best scores in the entire show. And the episode ends with Cersei on the Iron Throne. It also has the most shocking twist of the entire show of Jon being a Targaryen. Speaking of that twist, after being gone for all of Season 5, Bran finally makes his return in his last ever season of being an actual human being and not an emotionless robot that is for some reason made King of the Seven Kingdoms. Overall, this isn't as good as the first 4 seasons, but it definitely stands up there with them, just from a bit of a distance. And number 6, we have our newest season, House of the Dragon Season 2. Now, this is a very weird season, as every episode, I would say, is very good, and the season overall is very good. The problem is, it feels unfinished. It feels like if this had one more episode, this season would at least be 1 spot higher, maybe even 2, as it sets up an endpoint, but the season cuts off as we see the end goal, and instead leaves it up for Season 3. You can definitely tell the season was planned to be 10 episodes, but was only allowed to be 8. And due to the lack of that final episode that should have been, this season just ends up being set up. And unlike Season 1, which I would argue also was set up, it's set entirely in one point of time, meaning we spend 6 episodes of Daemon just tripping balls in a castle by himself, which sure, while that aspect does get a pretty good payoff in episode 8, the entire point of him being in that castle of building an army doesn't get any payoff aside from, hey, Rhaenyra has an army. But overall, this is still a very good season of TV. Sure, the finale doesn't feel like a finale, but it is still a very good episode overall. The biggest issue here is we just have to wait 2 years for Season 3. And number 5, I have Season 2. Out of the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, this season has always stood out as the worst to me. Now, while this is a good follow-up to Season 1, as it does pick up on all the threads left over, and does tell a rather satisfying story, this season feels pretty cheap. Despite having one of the biggest battles in the show with Episode 9, the entire season definitely feels like it doesn't have the budget that the season does have, because most of that went to Episode 9. Because of that, most of the season is either set in the forest, in tents, or in tents in the forest, with the exception of King's Landing. This season also lacks a oh shit moment that every other season has, with Season 1 being Ned's death, Season 3 being the Red Wedding, Season 4 just having a bunch of them, Season 5 being Jon's death, Season 6 being Cersei sitting in the Iron Throne, Season 7 being the Night Walkers getting over the wall, and Season 8 being Season 8. There's just a lot that goes up there, and the entire time you're just wondering why it's doing what it does. But back to my point itself, this season doesn't really feel like it has a bunch of stakes. Sure, the Battle of the Blackwater happens, but none of our main characters die. The highest casualty is Davos' son. Now, while you don't need deaths to tell a good story, with this entire season going on, and it being the War of the Five Kings, and really the only death that happens is Renly, and no one else we care about dies, and we didn't even really care about Renly, this entire season feels pretty unconsequential. I mean, Jon just spends the entire season above the wall, but doesn't join the wildlings yet, is just being held captive by the wildlings. Dany is just spends the entire season either in the desert or in this weird town where, again, nothing really happens. The only thing Robb really does this season is break his vow, but that doesn't really get payoff till next season. Sure, Theon takes over Winterfell, but the only people who were in Winterfell were Bran, and Bran was going to leave there anyways. So, this entire season doesn't really have much going on outside of King's Landing. The only big things that happen in King's Landing anyways is Tyrion becoming Hand of the King and doing a bunch of stuff, and then Tywin coming in and becoming Hand of the King and undoing all the stuff that Tyrion did. So yeah, while the season is very good written, and there is memorable moments, the season overall doesn't really feel like it has a much impact on the show as a whole. Next up, House of the Dragon Season 1. This season does everything that made Game of Thrones so great and adds a new twist to it. It has complex, interesting characters, great acting, great battles, shocking twist, and adds all that on top of a time-skipping gimmick which has every episode have months or even years between the last episode pass. This allows for very fast pacing, which means we skip over all the boring stuff and just hit the highlights that actually matter to the story overall, and it doesn't get drowned out by a bunch of other storylines. And because the entire story takes place with just like one family, it means that there isn't a bunch of other characters bogging down the story, as all of these characters know and interact with each other, so you don't have things going on the opposite side of the world that doesn't affect the other storylines. And even with all the time pacing, like all of Season 1 covering 20 years, you still understand every single character and get very powerful moments. like Daemon helping Viserys climb the Iron Throne and him putting the crown on Viserys' head. And nothing about the season seems forced or rushed. It really is amazing. Fittingly enough, in third place is Game of Thrones Season 3. I'm going to go ahead and say that it's this season that made Game of Thrones from a very good show to a phenomenon where everyone knew about it. You could have not seen a single episode of the show, but you still probably have heard of something called The Red Wedding. Every plotline here feels incredibly good, as Dany, instead of spending the entire season on one plotline, goes through two, which allows them to be very fast-paced and maintain interest. Jon actually goes through a very interesting character arc of having to decide between the wildlings and the woman he loves in the Night Watch, the place where he vowed he would serve his life to. King's Landing has some interesting stuff going on with the further torment of Sansa. This is also the season where Jaime becomes an actual likable character as he loses his hand, and the tub scene, which is also one of the best scenes of the entire show, right next to the Red Wedding, goes into Jaime's entire character and makes you understand and feel for him. Just overall, this is a really good season, and if it were pretty much any other show, this season would be the best. But this is Game of Thrones, so it only comes in at number 3. In the second spot, I have Game of Thrones Season 1. Now, depending on the day of the week, I could honestly switch this with Season 3. But today, I feel Season 1 is better than Season 3. And that's just because this is an amazing start to a show. I always love the first seasons or first movies of stories like this because you get to see the characters at their start and know all the things that they are going to go through. And you can compare where they started to how different they are where they end. You get to know that these characters won't see each other again for years, if they even do see each other again. It perfectly sets up plot points for both this season and every future season, and lays the groundwork for an amazing world, which has amazing world building, as you are engrossed in every character and want to learn more about them. Sure, there are characters that you don't like Jaime, but you're meant to not like them. There's not a single character here that is poorly written. Every story arc in this season is interesting. Overall, this is just a really good season of TV that set up an amazing show, and now universe. In number 1 was never a question to me. It's Season 4. This is just a show going off on all cylinders as every plotline is at its peak. You have King's Landing with the trial of Tyrion. You have the preparation for the battle in the north. You have Dany finally reaching Meereen and learning to be an actual ruler. You have Stannis preparing to rebuild his army, and by the end of the season, ending up in the north with the Night's Watch. You have Arya with the Hound. You have Brienne looking for Arya and Sansa. You have Sansa with Littlefinger in the Vale. You have interesting new characters like Oberyn. This season also has the most shocking amount of twists. You have Joffrey's death in episode 2. You have Tyrion's trial and speech in episode 6. You have the trial by combat for Tyrion, which has a very gruesome and shocking ending in episode 8. You have the battle for the wall in episode 9. And you have Stannis arriving in North in episode 10. And also in episode 10, you have Tyrion killing Tywin. Every character here is being wonderfully written, and every arc is being meticulously crafted to give the ultimate season of TV. And honestly, probably one of my favorite seasons of TV, or just media in general. It really is good. But yeah, that's really all I have to say. Comment down below your ranking, or say what you think of my ranking, or just comment on what other people think. But be respectful to both my opinions and others' opinions. All that being said, like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will catch you all next time. Later, haters.